Her billionaire husband gave his mistress her security badge. She returned every house key. The VIP turnstile gave one sharp beep, and Dr. Celine Fairborn watched the screen turn red. Access revoked. Level 1 credential transferred. She stood there, a 34-year-old black woman in a bright red dress that looked like power stitched into silk, while 20 feet ahead, Dorian Blackwell, a 39-year-old white billionaire in an elegant black suit, crossed the executive gate beside Daphne Ellery, a 31-year-old white woman in a delicate white dress that made her look fragile in the most rehearsed way. Around Daphne's neck hung a new Level 1 security badge carrying the clearance profile Celine had once controlled, the executive stripe, and the visible symbol of Celine's place inside the empire she had built, from invisible architecture and sleepless nights. In that second, Celine understood the cruelty. Her husband had not simply betrayed her heart. He had publicly reassigned her value. He had taken the symbol of her authority, placed it on another woman's chest, and expected the lobby to accept the substitution, as if intelligence could be transferred like jewelry. Celine did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not give anyone the spectacle they were waiting for. She looked once at Dorian, once at Daphne, then reached into her handbag and closed her fingers around the keys to the penthouse, the Aspen house, the private garage, and the lakefront retreat. She did not drop them at reception. She removed the wedding ring from her left hand, placed it with the keys inside a small black leather pouch, and slipped the pouch back into her bag like evidence being preserved. Malcolm Greaves, head of executive security, stood behind the counter with his jaw locked, because he knew who had designed the clearance hierarchy just used to humiliate her. Celine had built the Level 1 architecture 5 years earlier, when Blackwell Systems was still surviving on borrowed office space and one impossible promise. Back then, Dorian called her his mind behind the machine. Now he looked at her like she was a former permission. Daphne touched the badge lightly, admiring herself in the glass wall, and that gesture told Celine everything. Daphne believed the badge meant she had entered the kingdom. She did not understand the kingdom ran on systems Celine had written in silence, protocols she had hardened after midnight, and threat models she had rebuilt, while Dorian smiled for cameras. The guard at the turnstile cleared his throat. "Dr. Fairborn, I can call upstairs if there has been a mistake." Celine turned to him with a calm so precise it unsettled him. "There has not been a mistake." Dorian's expression shifted. Not guilt. Irritation. He had expected trembling, accusation, some sharp sentence he could later call unstable. Instead, she gave him nothing useful. She took a slim card from her handbag and wrote one sentence across it. All access returned. Then she signed only her initials, S.F. She handed the card to Malcolm. "Please note the time. 8:16 a.m. Celine glanced toward the VIP elevator, where Dorian and Daphne had stopped pretending not to watch. "My counsel will deliver the rest," she said. Dorian stepped forward. "Celine, this is not the place." She looked at him for 3 seconds and remembered the first server rack, the investor deck she rewrote while he slept, and the first breach she stopped before anyone knew the company had almost died. "You chose the place," she said. Then she turned away. No slammed door. No shaking hands. No broken voice. Behind her, the VIP elevator opened for Dorian and Daphne because badges still opened doors. But as Celine stepped outside, without wearing her ring, without surrendering her composure, and without the clearance he thought defined her, something colder began. Dorian Blackwell had given another woman her badge, so Celine Fairborn decided to return the whole life. By 8:42 that morning, the black leather pouch was on the glass desk of a private legal courier office 3 blocks from Blackwell Systems. Celine did not trust the building that had just reduced her to a revoked credential. She asked for a red wax seal, watched the clerk heat it over the envelope flap, and pressed the stamp herself, leaving one clean mark, F. Inside were the penthouse key, the Aspen house key, the sedan key fob, the lakefront retreat key, the disabled badge, and the wedding ring. On the delivery form, she wrote, "General Counsel, Blackwell Systems. Delivery instruction, hand to counsel during the active board session. No assistant. No mailroom. No delay." At 9:17, while Dorian stood before the board in his elegant black suit, and presented a stability report polished enough to hide panic. The envelope entered the room, with internal counsel Martin Harraby. Dorian stopped mid-sentence. Daphne Ellery sat near the end of the table in her white dress, Celine's former clearance stripe replicated on her executive badge. The red wax caught the boardroom light like a small wound. Martin placed the envelope beside Dorian's folder. "From Dr. Fairborn," he said. Dorian opened it, with the impatience of a man who believed every object existed to obey him. The keys slid into his palm. Then the wedding ring dropped last, small and bright, heavier than all the rest. Around him, directors pretended to study their papers. They saw everything. Daphne saw it too, and her softness lost its shape. The note inside contained one sentence. All domestic, marital, and executive access returned, as of 8:16 a.m. Dorian closed his fist too quickly, and that was the first crack in his performance. "Continue," he said, but his voice had lost half a degree of temperature. A director glanced toward Daphne's badge, then back to the ring in Dorian's hand. That glance did more damage than a shout. Across town, Celine did not go home. Home had become a list of doors she no longer wished to open. She took a private car to a furnished apartment near the seaport, rented under her own name, paid from her own account, with no shared concierge and no view chosen by Dorian. Only when the door locked behind her did Celine let her shoulders fall. In the lobby, she had been marble. Alone, she was human. Her left hand felt strangely light. She opened her old laptop. An archived folder appeared. Prototype_0. Lines of old code filled the screen, written when she and Dorian worked above a printing shop in Cambridge. At the top of a shared access protocol was the comment he had written years ago. "Trust is the first protocol." Celine stared until the letters blurred. She remembered coffee at 2:17 in the morning, the first failed authentication loop, and the belief that shared ambition could become love. That was the wound. Not Daphne, not the badge, not even the public humiliation. The wound was realizing a promise could remain in the code long after it had vanished from the man. One tear fell onto the laptop edge, and Celine wiped it away because she refused to let pain make decisions. Then she copied the archive to an encrypted drive and opened a new folder. The cursor blinked on a blank naming field. She typed slowly, with both hands steady now. "Fairborn Cyber Defense." At 11:09 a.m., Dorian messaged, "We need to discuss your behavior before this becomes damaging." Celine archived it. At 11:12, Helena Armitage received an urgent consultation request from Dr. Celine Fairborn. At 11:15, Celine hung the red dress on the back of a chair, not as something ruined, but as something that had survived the first strike. The wife who had walked into Blackwell Systems that morning was gone. The architect who knew where every weakness lived had just opened a new file. You see, what Dorian Blackwell did was not just betrayal. It was theater. He did not revoke Celine's access quietly through a private legal channel, and he did not ask for a difficult conversation behind closed doors. He chose the lobby, the VIP turnstile, the morning of the board meeting, and the woman in white wearing the badge that carried Celine's identity. That was not carelessness. That was choreography. Men like Dorian often understand symbolism better than they admit. He knew that a level 1 security badge was not a piece of plastic. It was rank. It was authorship. It was proof that Celine Fairborn had not merely married into his empire, but had engineered the invisible architecture keeping it alive. So when he placed that badge on Daphne Ellery, he was sending a message to every guard, assistant, executive, and investor watching from the edges of the room. He wanted them to believe Celine could be replaced without the system noticing. But here is the dangerous mistake. A public insult only works if the wounded person performs the role you wrote for them. Dorian wanted tears. He wanted anger. He wanted one sharp sentence he could later call unstable. Instead, Celine gave him a timestamp, a red wax envelope delivered through counsel, and a paper trail no publicist could explain away. And that is why her silence was so frightening. It did not protect him. It documented him. Tell me, what would you do if someone tried to erase not just your place, but your mind? Would you scream in the lobby, or would you leave them with exactly enough rope to reveal who they really were? Because Celine understood something most people only learn after the damage is done. When someone humiliates you in public, they are not only attacking your heart. They are trying to control the narrative before you can speak. Dorian's first attack was emotional, but his real strategy was reputational. If Celine reacted loudly, the board could call her volatile. If she begged, Daphne could look chosen. If she stayed, Dorian could pretend she had accepted the downgrade. But by walking away cleanly, Celine broke the frame. She refused to become evidence against herself. She made Dorian hold the ring, the keys, and the consequences in front of his own board. That is the psychology of power at its coldest. People who mistake kindness for dependence often panic when the kind person becomes precise. Celine's pain was real. We saw it in that apartment when she opened the old laptop and found the line that said trust was the first protocol. That moment matters because she was not born cold. She became controlled because the situation demanded discipline. There is a difference. A machine feels nothing. A disciplined woman feels everything and still chooses the move that protects her future. And Daphne, standing there in that white dress with Celine's badge on her chest, was not powerful either. She was decorated. She had been handed access without comprehension, status without structure, visibility without responsibility. That kind of borrowed power shines brightly for a moment, then becomes heavy when the room starts asking real questions. A badge can pass through a door. It cannot answer a board. It cannot rebuild an authentication layer. It cannot defend a company when the woman who designed the defense walks away. So remember this part carefully. Celine did not begin her revenge by destroying anything. She began by returning what no longer deserved her name, through the one channel Dorian could not spin, as emotion, legal procedure. Silence was not surrender. It was evidence collection. By the next morning, Dorian Blackwell had stopped pretending Celine's exit was only personal. At 7:06 a.m., her private research server rejected her master credentials. At 7:19, her archive account inside Blackwell Systems was frozen under the phrase Internal Compliance Review. At 7:43, a courier delivered a thick packet to the Seaport apartment, with her full married name printed in cold black letters across the front. Inside was a proposed non-compete agreement drafted to look routine and written to function like a cage. 36 months out of cybersecurity. No contact with former Blackwell clients. No independent product development involving enterprise defense, authentication infrastructure, access governance, behavioral anomaly detection, or any system substantially related to work performed during the marriage and employment period. Dorian had not sent an apology. He had sent a muzzle. Celine read every page at the glass desk in silence, wearing a simple black robe, her hair pulled back, her face still tired from a night without sleep. The woman who had cried over an old line of code was still inside her, but she was no longer the one holding the pen. At 8:02, she sent the packet to Helena Armitage. By 9:30, Helena arrived with 2 associates, 3 encrypted drives, and the expression of a woman who had seen powerful men confuse intimidation with law. Helena was in her late 40s, elegant in a charcoal suit, with silver at her temples and a voice that never rose because it never needed to. She placed Dorian's packet on the desk, opened it to the signature page, and smiled without warmth. "This is not a contract," she said. "This is a panic response wearing a tie." Celine did not smile. She pointed to the restriction on authentication infrastructure. "He knows where the value is." Helena looked at her carefully. "Then we prove where it began." For the next 9 hours, the apartment became a legal war room. Celine pulled archived commits from prototype_0, timestamped design notes from before the company's incorporation, independent threat models stored on personal drives, diagrams she had drafted before the first venture round, and handwritten notebooks from the Cambridge office above the printing shop. The paper trail was not dramatic. That made it stronger. Quiet evidence ages better than public outrage. Helena built a timeline showing which parts of the core security architecture had been created by Celine before Blackwell Systems ever classified them as company assets. The pattern was brutal. Dorian had marketed himself as the visionary, while Celine's frameworks had hardened the platform, reassured investors, and saved the company from breaches no press release ever admitted existed. At noon, Blackwell Systems issued an internal memo stating that Dr. Celine Fairborn had stepped away after a private marital matter affecting executive alignment. By 12:08, Dorian's legal team sent another letter, accusing her of possible breach of confidentiality if she contacted clients or investors. By 12:21, an anonymous leak reached a business reporter claiming Celine had been removed from sensitive systems due to emotional volatility. Dorian was not collapsing. He was attacking from every side he controlled. Access, reputation, money, fear. Celine stood by the window and looked down at the city, letting the anger pass through her without steering her. Then she turned back to Helena. Can we respond without sounding defensive? Helena slid a blank legal pad toward her. We respond like owners. That afternoon, Fairborn's legal notice went out in language so clean it felt surgical. It did not mention betrayal. It did not mention Daphne. It did not mention the lobby, the badge, the ring, or the keys. It stated that multiple proprietary frameworks authored independently by Dr. Celine Fairborn remained embedded in Blackwell Systems' enterprise security layer that continued use without proper licensing would trigger formal claims, and that any defamatory statements regarding her competence, stability, or professional conduct would be met with immediate legal action. Attached were exhibits, timestamps, version histories, authorship records, patent dependency maps, the kind of proof rich men hate because money cannot flatter it into changing shape. At Blackwell Systems, Dorian received the notice 15 minutes before the emergency audit briefing. He read the first page, then the second, then stopped when he saw the architecture map with Celine's initials in the earliest version field. Daphne sat beside him in her white dress, still wearing the badge, watching his confidence tighten into something harder. Is it serious? She asked. Dorian folded the document once, too sharply. It is noise, he said. But before the meeting ended, the central monitoring dashboard flickered yellow across 3 regions. A legacy authentication service failed to rotate cleanly. A banking client's sandbox environment rejected privileged access. An engineer whispered that the old fallback protocol had never been fully documented because Celine had always handled it herself. Dorian stared at the screen while the room waited for him to become the genius they had paid for. He adjusted his black suit cuff. He said nothing. Then the first server failed. Celine did not celebrate the first server failure. She knew too much about systems to enjoy collapse for its own sake. A broken security layer meant exposed clients, frightened employees, delayed payroll, frozen transactions, and ordinary people paying for executive arrogance they never voted for. That was why, at 6:30 the next morning, she sat in a small leased office on the 5th floor of a brick building in Boston's Fort Point district and wrote the first operating rule of Fairborn cyber defense on a whiteboard. We protect systems from ego. The office had no marble lobby, no private elevator, no wall of awards polished by public relations staff. It had 6 desks, 2 folding tables, a secure router, excellent coffee, and windows overlooking a street where delivery trucks moved before sunrise. To Dorian, it would have looked small. To Celine, it looked clean. Every chair in that room had been earned, not assigned. Her first hires arrived one by one. Priya Nandakumar, a 38-year-old cryptography engineer who had left a defense contractor because she was tired of watching mediocre men present her work. Marcus Bell, 42, a former incident response lead, with calm eyes and a habit of asking the question nobody wanted to answer. Elena Ward, 35, a compliance strategist who understood that legal language could be either a shield or a blade. 2 younger senior analysts, both over 30, came with quiet reputations and no patience for corporate theater. Helena Armitage stayed in the corner with her laptop open because every new line of code also needed a boundary around who owned it. Celine stood before them in a crimson-tailored suit, not the same red dress from the lobby, but the same message in a sharper form. We are not building a revenge company, she said. We are building the company I should have built before I let someone else put his name over my architecture. Nobody clapped. That made the moment better. They opened their laptops. The first product was called Aurelia Shield, a resilience platform designed for companies that could not afford to discover their vulnerabilities during a crisis. Celine shaped it around a principle Blackwell Systems had forgotten. Access should never depend on personality, marriage, influence, or executive mood. It should depend on verified role, behavior, need, and accountability. The platform watched for privilege drift, hidden dependency chains, orphan credentials, weak fallback protocols, and human decisions disguised as technical exceptions. In plain English, it found the doors powerful people forgot they had opened for themselves. By the end of the first week, Celine had refused 3 investor meetings that wanted gossip instead of governance. By the end of the second, she had accepted 1 discreet pilot with a regional financial firm whose chief risk officer had heard enough rumors about Blackwell Systems to stop feeling safe. By the end of the third, Aurelia Shield detected a dormant vendor credential inside that firm's environment that had survived 2 audits and 1 expensive consulting report. The client signed before lunch. At Blackwell Systems, Daphne Ellery was being introduced as Strategic Security Liaison, a title so polished it almost hid the emptiness beneath it. Dorian placed her at the conference table beside him, her white dress immaculate, Celine's former badge replaced now by a new executive credential, with Daphne's own name printed beneath the level 1 stripe. She smiled when the board looked at her. She smiled when the engineers presented the recovery plan. She smiled until a senior infrastructure lead asked how she wanted to prioritize root certificate rotation across the legacy authentication cluster. The room waited. Daphne touched her pen. "We should preserve executive continuity while optimizing the security posture," she said, repeating a phrase she had heard Dorian use the day before. The engineer blinked once. "Yes, but operationally, which trust chain do you want rotated first?" Daphne looked toward Dorian. For the first time, the badge around her neck seemed less like jewelry and more like weight. Dorian answered for her, but everyone noticed the delay. Power can survive many things. It struggles to survive silence from the person who is supposed to understand. That evening, Celine stayed late in the Fort Point office after everyone else left. She walked between the desks, checking screens, reviewing notes, adjusting a diagram on the glass wall. There was still grief inside her, but it no longer sat at the head of the table. Work did. Purpose did. Ownership did. At 10:14 p.m. Her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Dorian is telling people you built nothing without him." Celine read it, then placed the phone face down. She returned to the code review and added 1 comment to the core logic of Aurelia Shield. Never trust borrowed authority. Then she committed the change under her own name. 18 months later, Fairborn cyber defense no longer looked small to anyone who understood the market. The Fort Point office had expanded into 3 floors, then into a private headquarters overlooking Boston Harbor, with glass conference rooms named after principals instead of founders: integrity, resilience, accountability, continuity. Celine refused to hang portraits of herself in the lobby. She hung system maps instead. To visitors, they looked like beautiful abstract lines of light and logic. To clients, they looked like survival. Aurelia Shield had become the platform executives whispered about before they admitted they needed it. It protected private banks, medical data networks, insurance groups, logistics companies, and 2 major cloud infrastructure partners, whose names never appeared in press releases because the best cybersecurity work often remained invisible. Celine accepted that. She had spent years being invisible inside a man's empire. Now invisibility belonged to the product, not the woman. Her name appeared, where it mattered, on ownership documents, patent filings, licensing agreements, board minutes, and regulatory advisory panels. She walked into meetings in brilliant red tailored dresses and crimson suits that made every room understand she had not softened to be accepted. She had sharpened. During 1 quarterly review, Marcus Bell presented a growth chart showing that Fairborn Cyber Defense had secured nearly 9 figures in contracted annual revenue faster than any woman-led cybersecurity company in its category. Priya followed with a technical report showing Aurelia Shield had prevented 3 privilege escalation incidents across client environments in 1 month. Elena Ward closed with contract renewals from firms that had previously belonged to Blackwell Systems. The room stayed calm because Celine had taught them not to confuse noise with strength. Then Priya smiled and said, We are now the standard they are trying to imitate. Celine looked at the data for a long moment. Then we improve, before they catch the old version, she said. That was how she led. No victory lap. No revenge speech. Just the discipline of staying ahead. Outside her company, the language around her had changed. Reporters who once called her Dorian Blackwell's brilliant wife now called her a founder, architect, and chief executive. Investors who once asked whether her divorce would distract her now waited 3 months for 15 minutes on her calendar. At a private finance forum in Chicago, a senior banking chairman introduced her as the woman who made access governance impossible to ignore. Celine corrected him gently. Access was always impossible to ignore, she said. Some companies simply ignored the wrong people. The line traveled across the industry within hours. At Blackwell Systems, the opposite was happening, with the same quiet speed. Dorian still arrived in an elegant black suit, still spoke in controlled sentences, still appeared on magazine covers beside phrases like legacy innovator and transition leader. But the company under him had become nervous. The old platform needed patches that behaved like bandages. Audits took longer. Client calls grew colder. Engineers left in pairs, then in teams. A senior vice president resigned after warning the board that Blackwell's core security layer had become strategically dependent on undocumented historical architecture. Everyone knew what that meant. Celine. Daphne Ellery remained beside Dorian. White dresses replaced by pale designer suits. Her level 1 credential still active. Her office still large. Her authority still ceremonial. She had learned the vocabulary better by then. She could say zero trust, behavioral drift, and certificate lifecycle without flinching. But when engineers asked for decisions, she answered in polished circles. The more she learned to sound competent, the more obvious it became that sounding was not building. One afternoon, during a failed audit rehearsal, a compliance officer asked Daphne to explain why a fallback privilege pathway still routed through a retired dependency chain. Daphne stared at the diagram. She knew every eye in the room was waiting for the mind that should have been behind the badge. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Dorian stepped in again. This time, the board chair noticed. That evening, Celine stood in the quiet executive suite of her own headquarters, looking out over the harbor as the office lights reflected behind her. She had not destroyed Dorian. She had outgrown the architecture of needing him to fail in order for her to rise. Still, consequences had their own discipline. A company built on borrowed brilliance eventually receives the bill, and Blackwell Systems was running out of credit. Dorian Blackwell did not fall in one dramatic afternoon. Men like him rarely do. They descend by refusing to look down. At first, he called the losses temporary. Then he called them market correction. Then he called them a coordinated smear against a founder under pressure. Every phrase sounded expensive, polished, and empty enough to pass through a boardroom without being challenged by people who still wanted the stock price to recover. But numbers do not respect ego. By the second quarter, after Fairborn cyber defense became the industry standard, Blackwell Systems had lost 4 major enterprise clients, 2 insurance carriers, 1 regional banking consortium, and a federal adjacent infrastructure contract that had taken Dorian 3 years to win. The official explanation was platform modernization delay. The private explanation was Celine Fairborn had left, and no one had truly replaced her. Dorian's first instinct was not humility. It was control. He ordered his legal team to file a sweeping claim against Fairborn Cyber Defense, accusing Celine of unfair competition, unauthorized use of trade secrets, breach of confidentiality, and deliberate market interference. He demanded an injunction against Aurelia Shield, emergency discovery of her technical documents, and a public statement implying her company had been built on stolen knowledge from Blackwell Systems. The lawsuit landed like thunder across the cybersecurity world. For 12 hours, Dorian believed he had regained the narrative. Then Helena Armitage answered. Her response was not emotional. It was architectural. Page by page, exhibit by exhibit, she mapped the origin of Celine's core frameworks back to independent notebooks, archived repositories, personal research logs, and timestamps created before Blackwell Systems had legally acquired the assets Dorian claimed. The record showed that Dorian's company had not been robbed by Celine. It had been surviving on her uncredited foundation. During the preliminary hearing, Dorian sat in a black suit, so perfectly tailored it almost disguised the tension in his shoulders. Daphne Ellery sat 2 seats behind him in a white dress, her face composed, her hands locked around a tablet she barely looked at. Across the room, Celine wore a deep red sheath dress and said almost nothing. She did not need to. Helena displayed a version history from prototype_0, then a patent dependency chart, then an internal Blackwell email in, which Dorian had referred to Celine's architecture as the invisible spine of the platform. The judge asked Dorian's counsel a simple question. If Dr. Fairborn did not substantially originate these frameworks, why does your own internal documentation describe them as hers? Dorian's attorney requested time to review. Everyone understood what that meant. Outside court, reporters waited for anger, tears, or scandal. Celine gave them one sentence. Systems should tell the truth about who built them. Then she left. Inside Blackwell Systems, the damage moved faster than public relations could soften it. Engineers began forwarding old documentation gaps to compliance. Former executives requested indemnity reviews. Clients demanded written assurance that their environments did not rely on disputed architecture. The board formed a special committee with a name that sounded harmless and meant danger. Daphne's borrowed authority weakened by the hour. In one emergency meeting, a senior board member asked her to walk through the recovery plan for the core access layer without Dorian's assistance. The room became still. Daphne looked at the screen, at the diagrams, at the red risk markers pulsing across client environments. She knew the phrases. She knew the posture. She knew how to lean forward and look concerned. But she did not know how the system breathed. I would defer to engineering on implementation, she said. It was a reasonable sentence in the wrong mouth. The board member looked past her to Dorian. That glance ended her illusion more cruelly than any insult could have. Later, alone in her glass office, Daphne removed the Level 1 credential from around her neck and placed it on the desk. For months, she had believed the badge made her important. Now it looked like an accusation. Dorian found her there, after another client termination call. Put it back on, he said. Daphne looked at him, pale and shaken. They know I do not understand it. Dorian's jaw tightened, then learned faster. But both of them knew the truth. You can memorize language. You cannot fake architecture under pressure. By midnight, Blackwell Systems monitoring dashboards glowed across 3 floors like a city losing power 1 block at a time. A privilege escalation patch failed in the European cluster. A legacy dependency refused a certificate update. A banking client suspended integration. The board chair sent Dorian one message. We need to discuss leadership continuity. Dorian stood alone in his executive office, high above Manhattan, surrounded by awards, glass, and silence. His name was still on the door. His suit was still immaculate. His empire was still visible from the street. But the mind that had held it together was gone, and for the first time, the building seemed to know it before he did. The intellectual property trial began on a Tuesday morning in a federal courtroom, so cold and plain it seemed designed to strip glamour out of every lie. There were no cameras, no polished introductions, no applause waiting to soften the truth. There was polished wood, fluorescent silence, a jury box filled with people paid to listen carefully, and a judge who did not care how expensive a black suit looked if the evidence beneath it failed. Celine Fairborn entered in a bright red tailored dress with clean architectural lines, her posture calm, her hair swept back, her face composed in the way of a woman who had already survived the worst room and chosen to enter this one on purpose. Helena Armitage walked beside her, with 3 trial binders, 2 encrypted drives, and the quiet authority of a lawyer who preferred documents to drama. Dorian Blackwell sat at the defense table in an elegant black suit, still handsome, still controlled, still trying to look like the founder the market used to applaud. Daphne Ellery sat behind him in a white dress, her executive badge absent for the first time in months, her hands folded around a tablet she did not open. The courtroom did not care who had been chosen in the lobby. It cared who had written the code. Helena began with the cleanest timeline. She showed the jury the incorporation date of Blackwell Systems, then the first investor round, then the first internal architecture claim Dorian's company had made years later. After that, she opened prototype_0. The old repository appeared on the courtroom screen in lines of plain text that looked almost modest until Helena began reading the metadata aloud. Commit author, Celine Fairborn. Timestamp, 18 months before Blackwell Systems filed its dependent patent. Comment, trust is the first protocol. The courtroom stayed still. Helena displayed the original access governance model, then the early authentication loop, then the fallback protocol that Blackwell Systems had later marketed as proprietary infrastructure. Each line had a history. Each history had a date. Each date pointed away from Dorian. His attorney objected twice, then stopped when the judge asked whether he was objecting to the evidence or its consequences. That was the first public humiliation. Not a headline, not a shout. A judge's patience thinning in front of 12 jurors. Dorian adjusted his cuff. He did not look at Daphne. Helena continued. She produced an internal email from Dorian to an early investor describing Celine's framework as the invisible spine of the platform. Then she produced a later executive memo, drafted after the badge incident, calling Celine a former executive with limited current relevance to core systems. The contradiction sat between those two documents like a blade placed flat on the table. Helena turned to the jury. A company cannot call a woman the spine when it needs money, then call her irrelevant when it wants ownership. Celine did not lower her eyes. Daphne did. For the first time, the woman in white seemed to understand that the badge had never been the center of the story. It had only been the insult that revealed the theft. When Helena called the forensic code analyst, the room became even quieter. He explained commit chains, hash verification, archive integrity, and dependency maps in language the jury could follow. He showed how Blackwell's disputed modules still carried structural choices unique to Celine's original framework. Dorian's counsel tried to suggest that great companies build collaboratively, but the analyst answered, with one sentence, that made a juror lean forward. Collaboration leaves many fingerprints. This architecture begins with one. Dorian's face did not break. That made it worse. A visible collapse might have earned pity. His controlled stillness only reminded the room how long he had practiced being believed. By the afternoon recess, the courtroom had turned against the myth. Investors in the gallery whispered less. Reporters typed more. Board representatives from Blackwell Systems stared at the exhibits like people watching a building inspection reveal the foundation was not theirs. Daphne sat alone during the break, looking at her empty lanyard clip, and understood how completely she had mistaken access for a rival. Celine stood near Helena at the plaintiff table, not triumphant, not cruel, simply present. Dorian had once put another woman through a VIP gate, with Celine's authority around her neck. Now Helena was putting Celine's original code before a jury, line by line, and no badge in the world could interrupt the record. The court-ordered inspection of the old Cambridge office took place 3 days later, and the room seemed smaller than memory had allowed. It sat above a printing shop on a narrow street, where the brick walls held winter cold even in late afternoon, and the floorboards complained under every polished shoe. No photographers were allowed. No investors. No boardroom assistants. Only Celine, Helena, Dorian, his counsel, a neutral forensic examiner, and Daphne Ellery standing near the door in a white coat, over a pale dress, as quiet as a person, who finally understood she had no real function in the room. The judge had authorized the inspection after Helena argued that the original local backup drives and notebooks remained tied to the earliest version of prototype_0. Dorian's legal team had resisted. That resistance made the judge curious. Curiosity, in court, can be fatal. The forensic examiner opened the old metal filing cabinet Celine remembered buying used for $60 when the company had no furniture worth protecting. Inside were notebooks, hardware receipts, printed architecture diagrams, and a small external drive wrapped in an anti-static sleeve. Celine looked at it and felt time fold without mercy. She saw herself younger, exhausted, hopeful. She saw Dorian before the black suits became armor. She saw trust before it was converted into leverage. Helena asked the examiner to connect the drive to an isolated machine. The folder appeared. Prototype_0. Dorian's attorney shifted. Dorian did not. The examiner opened the earliest file. Lines of code filled the monitor, And there, at the top of the access protocol, sat the old comment again. Trust is the first protocol. Below it were Celine's initials, her commit notes, her naming conventions, her design logic, and a timestamp that made Dorian's ownership claim look less like a dispute and more like a story told after the fact. Helena did not speak immediately. She let the room hear the silence. Then she said, "This is where it began." Dorian finally looked at Celine. Not at the lawyer, not at the examiner. At Celine. "We built this together," he said. His voice was lower than it had been in court, almost intimate, almost useful. Celine turned from the monitor to him. "We worked in the same room," she said. "That is not the same thing." The sentence landed harder because the brick walls gave it nowhere to go. Daphne looked down at her hands. For months, she had worn authority taken from a woman whose mind was still written into every layer of the system. Now the original room had made that truth physical. Dorian tried again. "Blackwell Systems is under leadership review. The board will remove me if the ruling goes against us. 2 clients are holding termination notices. The European cluster still has unresolved authentication instability. If you help us reconstruct the core access layer, I can restore your founder credit publicly. Equity, licensing, whatever you want." Celine listened, because the man he had once been deserved the dignity of being refused clearly. But she did not move closer. "You are asking me to repair a system after using that system to erase me," she said. Dorian's control thinned. "This is bigger than us." Celine almost smiled, but not with warmth. "It was always bigger than us. That was the point you missed." Daphne lifted her head then, and Celine looked at her without hatred. The white coat, the pale dress, the careful face, the absence of a badge. Daphne looked less like a rival now than a witness to her own emptiness. "You should stop accepting keys to rooms you cannot understand," Celine said. Daphne swallowed, and for once, she did not defend herself. Dorian stepped forward. Helena's eyes sharpened, but Celine raised one hand slightly. "No drama, no fear, only boundary." "Do not make this personal," Dorian said. Celine's answer was immediate. "You made it personal in a lobby. Helena made it factual in court." His face changed at that. He could survive anger. He could fight accusation. But facts had become a door he could not pass through. "So this is revenge?" he asked. Celine looked at the monitor, at the old code, at the sentence that had once broken her heart and then became her rule. "No," she said. "This is access control." The forensic examiner sealed the drive as evidence. Helena signed the chain of custody form. Dorian stood in the room where his empire had started and understood, too late, that the foundation had never belonged to his name alone. Celine walked out last. She did not take the old drive. She did not touch the filing cabinet. She did not look back at the rented brick room that had taught her the difference between memory and ownership. Outside, Cambridge was quiet. Inside, Dorian remained with his black suit, his failing company, and the woman in white, who had once worn a badge that opened the wrong door. He had once given Celine's badge away. Now he could not get past her proof. You see, Dorian Blackwell did not lose, because Celine Fairborn became cruel. He lost because he built an empire that depended on a woman he refused to honor. That is a very specific kind of arrogance. It does not simply want love, labor, intelligence, loyalty, and silence. It wants all of those things, while still keeping the right to rename them as luck, support, or background help. And when that arrogance is challenged, it often reaches for the same tools Dorian used: access revoked, legal threats, reputation attacks, public humiliation, and one carefully dressed replacement placed where the real mind used to stand. But the tragedy of borrowed authority is that it always reaches a room where the badge is not enough. Sometimes that room is not a glittering stage. Sometimes it is a cold courtroom where a judge asks one clean question. Sometimes it is an old brick office in Cambridge where the original code still remembers who wrote it. Tell me, have you ever watched someone underestimate a quiet woman because she did not perform her pain loudly enough? Have you ever seen a person mistake grace for weakness, only to learn that grace was the last courtesy before the door closed forever? Celine's power was never that she stopped hurting. Her power was that she refused to let hurt become her manager. After the court inspection, Dorian's lawsuit collapsed. into settlement negotiations shaped almost entirely by Helena Armitage's evidence. Blackwell Systems withdrew its claims against Fairborn Cyber Defense, issued a corrected authorship statement, and entered a licensing agreement that named Celine's independent frameworks as foundational to several disputed modules. The language was formal. The humiliation was not. Within 6 months, Blackwell Systems was forced into restructuring. Dorian stepped down from executive control under the elegant phrase strategic leadership transition, though everyone in the industry understood what it meant. The board appointed an interim CEO, hired outside architecture auditors, and began the long process of documenting what should have been credited years earlier. Some clients stayed. Many left. The company did not vanish, because real life rarely grants such perfect endings, but it became smaller, quieter, and permanently marked by the cost of erasing the wrong woman. Daphne Ellery resigned before the restructuring was complete. Her departure statement thanked the company for a period of extraordinary learning, which was the safest, truthful sentence she could offer. No one mocked her publicly. Celine would not have wanted that. Daphne had been vain, yes. Complicit, yes. But she had also become a lesson in how dangerous it is to accept a seat built from someone else's removal. The white dress disappeared from the industry photographs. So did the badge. Celine, meanwhile, kept building. Fairborn Cyber Defense expanded its fellowship for women in cybersecurity architecture, not as charity, but as correction. She funded legal clinics for technical founders, whose work had been hidden behind louder names. She spoke at universities, boardrooms, and private risk councils, always returning to the same principle. Systems remember what organizations try to deny. At the new Fairborn headquarters, the red wax envelope was never displayed in the lobby. The ring was not framed. The keys were not turned into a symbol. Celine kept none of that as a trophy, because the life she returned was not the life she wanted to worship. Instead, in the main conference room, one sentence appeared in brushed steel on the wall. Trust is the first protocol. It was no longer a romantic memory. It was a governance rule. Years later, when a young founder asked Celine whether walking away had been the hardest part, she paused before answering. She thought of the lobby, the red error screen, the woman in white, the man in black, the red wax sealing the keys, the cold courtroom, the old brick room in Cambridge, and the folder named Prototype Under 0 that had once broken her heart. Then she said, "No, the hardest part was realizing I had been calling captivity loyalty." That is where the story leaves us. Not with revenge burning everything down, but with a woman reclaiming the intelligence, dignity, and authorship that were always hers. A badge can open a door, but intelligence built the whole building. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.